She was forced to marry a waiter to save her family's company. He was quiet, simple, and asked for nothing. What she didn't know, the waiter was the most powerful mafia boss in the city, and marrying her was never an accident. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Aria Bennett had survived a lot of Tuesdays, bad ones, brutal ones, the kind that left marks. But this Tuesday was different. This one came with a number that made her stomach drop straight through the floor of her Manhattan office. $4.2 million. She read it 3 times, then a 4th. The words didn't change. Outstanding debt, immediate repayment required. Failure to comply will result in full asset seizure of Bennett Enterprises within 48 hours. Aria set the letter down on her desk like it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. Outside her floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City buzzed with its usual indifference. Yellow cabs, lunch crowds, pigeons that didn't care about anything. She envied them. "Tell me this is a mistake," she said without turning around. Her assistant, Maya, stood near the doorway, clutching a tablet to her chest. "I've checked it twice. The debt is real, the creditor is real, and the 48-hour clock," she hesitated. "It started this morning." Aria finally turned. At 31, she had the kind of face that had learned not to show panic in public. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that calculated fast, a jaw set like she was always 3 steps ahead. Right now, she was calculating nothing. She was just scared. "Where did this debt come from?" she asked. "My father's been out of the company for 2 years. I've reviewed every account, every contract. There was nothing like this." Maya placed the tablet on her desk without a word. Aria looked down. There it was. A scanned document dated 4 years ago, signed in her father's unmistakable looping handwriting. A private loan agreement. No bank, no institution, just a name at the top of the letterhead. Voss Capital Holdings. She didn't recognize it. She Googled it immediately. Nothing. No website, no registered address, no LinkedIn. Just a ghost company with a very real demand. Her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something in her gut told her to answer it. "Miss Bennett?" The voice on the other end was smooth, not threatening, which somehow made it worse. Calm people with power never needed to raise their voice. "I assume you've reviewed our correspondence?" "Who is this?" "Someone who holds a considerable amount of your family's future in his hands." A brief pause. "Your father was a desperate man 4 years ago. He came to us when no bank would touch him. We helped him. The company survived. And now the time has come to settle." Aria's fingers tightened around the phone. $4.2 million in 48 hours is not a settlement. It's an execution. "We prefer the word resolution." Another pause, longer this time. "But there is an alternative." She should have hung up right there. Every instinct she'd built over a decade in business told her that when a faceless creditor with no paper trail offers you an alternative, you walk away and call your lawyer. She didn't walk away. What alternative? Marriage. The word landed like a stone in still water. Aria blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "There is a man. His name is Leo Carter. He works at Meridian, the restaurant on 5th. He is willing to enter a legal marriage with you. If you agree, the debt is wiped. All $4.2 million, completely cleared." For 3 full seconds, Aria said nothing. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "You want me to marry a waiter to clear my father's debt? Do you hear yourself?" "I hear myself clearly, Miss Bennett. The question is whether you hear me." The calm in his voice didn't crack even slightly. "You have 47 hours and some minutes remaining. I'd suggest not spending too many of them laughing." The line went dead. Aria spent the next 4 hours trying to find a way out. She called her lawyer first. He told her the contract her father signed was airtight, frighteningly so. Whoever had drafted it knew exactly how to make it unbreakable under New York law. The debt was real, the timeline was real, and the clause about alternative resolution, marriage to one Leo Carter, was written in clean, binding legal language that her lawyer read twice before going very quiet. "Arya," he said carefully, "if you don't pay, and you don't comply, they can take everything. The building, the accounts, the brand, all of it, legally, within 2 days." She called her father next. He answered on the third ring, and the moment she said Voss Capital, she heard him exhale. The long, deflating sound of a man whose secret had finally caught up with him. "Dad?" Her voice was low, controlled, barely. "Tell me everything." He did. 4 years ago, Bennett Enterprises had been 3 weeks from bankruptcy. A silent investor approached him. No meetings, no face, just a phone call and a wire transfer that saved the company. He'd signed without fully reading. He'd been desperate. He'd told himself he'd figure it out later. Later was now. "I'm sorry, Arya." His voice cracked. "I didn't think it would come to this. I didn't think—" "Who is Leo Carter?" she cut in. Silence. "Dad? Who is he?" "I don't know," her father said quietly. "I was just told that he was the condition, that if the money couldn't be returned, you would have to marry him. They said he'd keep you safe." Safe? From what? Arya stood at her office window long after she hung up, watching the city below move in its usual relentless rhythm. People with normal problems. People who didn't have to decide in 47 hours whether to lose everything they'd built or marry a complete stranger. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed everything to see this company survive. She thought about the 43 employees whose salaries she signed every month. She thought about 5 years of 18-hour days, of deals closed on 3 hours of sleep, of a name she'd rebuilt from the edge of ruin. Then she picked up her phone and made the call she never thought she'd make in her life. "Tell Leo Carter," she said when the smooth voice answered, "that I'll do it." A pause, then almost gently, "Wise choice, Miss Bennett. The ceremony is tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, Manhattan Courthouse." Another beat. "Do wear something appropriate. First impressions matter." The line went dead again. Arya stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She had just agreed to marry a man she had never met, a waiter, a stranger, for reasons that made no sense and carried a warning she didn't yet understand. He'd keep you safe. She didn't know what that meant yet. She had no idea, none at all, that by this time tomorrow night, her entire understanding of safe would be shattered completely. Arya didn't sleep. She spent the night the way she spent most crises, at her desk, working. If her hands were busy, her mind couldn't spiral. She reviewed contracts, answered emails that didn't need answering, and made a list of every possible exit strategy she hadn't tried yet. By 3 a.m., the list was empty. By 5 a.m., she'd accepted it. By 8 a.m., she was standing in front of her bathroom mirror in a cream silk blouse and tailored gray trousers, telling herself this was just a transaction. A transaction. Like a merger. Like signing a vendor contract. People made calculated decisions every day. Decisions that looked insane from the outside, but made perfect sense on paper. This was no different. She almost believed it. The Manhattan courthouse on a Wednesday morning smelled like floor polish and old paper. A few lawyers moved through the lobby with coffee cups and rolling briefcases. A couple near the window argued in hushed voices about something Arya didn't catch. Nobody looked at her twice. She arrived at 9:52 a.m. He was already there. Leo Carter stood near the far end of the hall with his hands relaxed at his sides, wearing a plain white shirt, dark trousers, and shoes that were clean but clearly worn. He was taller than she'd expected, well over 6 feet, with a lean, controlled build that his simple clothes did nothing to emphasize. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been cut with something precise, and eyes, when he turned and they met hers for the first time, that were a shade of gray so pale they were almost silver. He didn't smile. He didn't look nervous. He just looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already made peace with. Arya walked toward him with her chin level and her hand extended, because if this was a transaction, she would conduct it professionally. "Arya Bennett," she said. He looked at her hand for a half-second, then shook it. His grip was firm, unhurried. "Leo Carter." His voice was low, even. No accent she could place. "You look like you haven't slept." "And you look like you do this every Wednesday," she replied. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one that decided not to fully arrive. "We should go in," he said. "The clerk is ready." The ceremony took 11 minutes. There was no music, no flowers, no family. Arya had told her father not to come because she didn't trust herself not to fall apart if she saw his face, and falling apart was not on her schedule. 2 courthouse employees served as witnesses. The officiant was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who read the standard vows with the energy of someone reciting a grocery list. Arya said, "I do," and felt absolutely nothing. Or she told herself that. Leo said, "I do," and didn't break eye contact with her once, which she found oddly unsettling, because most people blinked more than that. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," a silence stretched between them for exactly 2 seconds. Then Leo simply said, "Thank you," to the officiant, signed the certificate, and handed Arya the pen. She signed her name beneath his. Arya Carter. She stared at it for a moment longer than she intended. Outside the courthouse, the April air was sharp with a kind of cold that hadn't decided yet whether it was winter or spring. Arya pulled her coat tighter and glanced sideways at the man who was now, legally, her husband. He was scanning the street. Not casually, not the way people idly glance around. He was reading it. His eyes moved in a specific pattern, left to right, near to far, pausing at certain points before moving on, like he was doing math. "Looking for something?" she asked. "No," he said simply. Then, "My car is this way." She followed him because she had nowhere else to go. The car was a black sedan, modest, clean, the kind of vehicle that blended completely into New York traffic. But when Leo opened the passenger door for her and she slid in, she noticed things that snagged in her mind like fabric on a nail. The interior was immaculate, not just clean, detailed. The leather was high quality, and fixed discreetly into the center console was a small secondary screen, dark and inactive, of the kind she'd only seen in vehicles used by private security firms. She said nothing. Leo got in, started the engine, and pulled smoothly into traffic. For the first 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was more like 2 people standing on opposite sides of a very long bridge, neither willing to step onto it first. Arya broke it. "I need to understand the terms," she said, "of this arrangement. How long are we expected to maintain it? What are the conditions for—" "The debt is cleared," he said. "Your company is safe. That was the agreement." "That was their agreement. I'm asking about ours." He glanced at her briefly, just briefly. "Then back to the road. You'll stay in my apartment for now, for appearances. After a reasonable period, we revisit." "How reasonable?" "Months, not years." She nodded slowly, filing it away. "And what do I tell people? My colleagues, the people in my life?" "Whatever keeps them calm," he said. "Keep it simple. People believe simple stories." Arya turned to look at him properly then, this stranger she'd just married, with his unreadable face and his careful, economic answers that gave away nothing. Everything about him was controlled. Too controlled, she realized. Not the control of a calm person, the control of someone who had spent years learning to appear calm. That was when she saw it. His sleeve had shifted slightly as he turned the wheel, and there it was, a flash of silver at his wrist. She caught it for only a second before the sleeve fell back into place, but it was enough. The watch beneath his cuff was not the watch of a man who served tables for a living. She knew watches. Her late grandfather had collected them, and she'd learned the names by heart as a child. That was a Patek Philippe Nautilus, platinum case, the kind of watch that cost more than most people's annual salary. She looked away before he could notice her noticing. Her mind was already moving fast. The secondary screen in the console, the way he'd read the street outside the courthouse, the men she'd clocked on her way in, 2 of them across the road, who hadn't looked like pedestrians. And now a watch worth $250,000 under the sleeve of a man who supposedly worked the dinner shift at a midtown restaurant. He'd keep you safe. Her father's words surfaced again, different now, heavier. She turned to face the window and watched the city give way to boroughs, streets growing quieter, buildings shorter. Queens. He was taking her to Queens. She said nothing, but the transaction she'd convinced herself she was walking into no longer felt like a transaction. It felt like the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, something she wasn't sure she was prepared for. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion and the anger and the pride she was holding together with both hands, she felt it, the faint, dangerous pull of curiosity. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. Aria stood in the narrow hallway while Leo unlocked the door, taking in the peeling paint on the walls, the flickering light above the stairwell, the faint smell of someone's dinner drifting up from below. It was the kind of building that New York kept tucked between the louder, shinier things, unremarkable by design, invisible by habit. The apartment itself was small, lived in but sparse. A couch, a kitchen that fit one person comfortably, 2 doors she assumed led to a bedroom and bathroom, a single window overlooking a fire escape and the brick wall of the building opposite. No art, no personal photographs, no clutter. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a place someone slept between other places. "It's not much," Leo said, setting his keys on the kitchen counter. He didn't say it apologetically, just factually. "I noticed," Aria replied, just as evenly. She set her overnight bag near the couch. She'd grabbed it that morning out of grim practicality, and took a slow breath. This was it. Day 1 of whatever this was. She would be professional. She would be composed. She would treat this like a business arrangement and get through it the way she got through every difficult thing, one calculated step at a time. "I'll take the couch," Leo said. She turned. "It's your apartment." "And you're my guest." "I'm your wife," she said, and the word came out sharper than she intended. Not warm, not cold, just strange and ill-fitting, like a coat the wrong size. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once and disappeared into the bedroom, returning with a pillow and a folded blanket that he laid on the couch without ceremony. "There's food in the kitchen," he said. "Help yourself." "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten since this morning." She frowned. She hadn't mentioned that. She hadn't mentioned anything about her morning. Before she could ask how he knew, he had already turned toward the window, that same focused, calculated scan of the street below. 3 seconds, left to right, near to far. "Is there something out there?" she asked. "No," he said. Same answer as before. She didn't believe him this time either. She was standing in the kitchen 20 minutes later, drinking a glass of water she didn't want just to have something to do with her hands, when the front door exploded inward. Not metaphorically. The door physically burst open, hinges shrieking, wood splintering at the frame, and 4 men poured into the apartment in the space of 2 seconds. Big men, armed men. The kind whose bodies were built around the specific purpose of occupying space in a way that made other people feel immediately, viscerally, small. Arya dropped the glass. It shattered on the kitchen floor, but she barely heard it because her entire system had gone into a white, ringing silence. Her back hit the refrigerator. Her hands came up instinctively. Useless, she knew. Useless. And every rational thought she'd spent years building deserted her at once, leaving behind nothing but pure, cold, animal terror. She opened her mouth. "Don't scream." Leo's voice. Quiet. Calm. Coming from directly beside her. She hadn't even heard him cross the apartment. He was between her and the men now, his body positioned with a precision that didn't look like panic and didn't look like fear. It looked practiced. The 4 men had stopped moving. They stood in a loose formation just inside the ruined doorway, weapons held but not raised, eyes forward. And then, in a motion so synchronized it seemed almost rehearsed, they dropped. Not to attack, to kneel. All 4 of them, down on one knee, heads slightly bowed, in the narrow hallway of a queen's apartment that smelled like someone else's dinner. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Arya had ever heard. The man at the front, older than the others, a scar running through his left eyebrow, the kind of face that had made difficult decisions and stopped apologizing for them, spoke without looking up. "Boss, we have a problem." Boss. Arya's gaze snapped to Leo. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't done any of the things a waiter from Queens should have done when 4 armed men broke down his door. He hadn't reached for a phone, hadn't backed against a wall, hadn't made a single sound of shock. Because he wasn't shocked. He crossed his arms slowly, and the version of him that had carried her overnight bag up 4 flights of stairs, the quiet, measured, carefully unremarkable man, simply ceased to exist. What stood in his place was something else entirely. Same face, same eyes, but the stillness around him had changed quality. It wasn't the stillness of a calm person anymore. It was the stillness of someone at the center of things. "Stand up," Leo said. They stood. He glanced at the man with the scar. "How many?" 6. 2 blocks east. They know the location. Timeline? 20 minutes, maybe less. Leo nodded once. Then he turned to Arya. She realized she hadn't moved. She was still pressed against the refrigerator, the broken glass around her feet, staring at him with an expression she couldn't control and didn't try to. Every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her composure had simply, quietly, collapsed. Arya. His voice was different with her name in it. Not softer, exactly, but more deliberate, like he was choosing each word from a smaller, more careful set. "I need you to listen to me right now." "Who are you?" she whispered. He held her gaze, didn't look away, didn't dress it up. "I'll explain everything," he said, "but not here. We have to move." "Who are you?" she said again, louder this time, and there was nothing composed about it, nothing professional or calculated, just the raw, stripped-down demand of someone who has just discovered the ground beneath them was never solid. Leo stepped closer, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be certain she heard him clearly. "Right now, in this moment, I am the only person standing between you and 6 men who will use you to get to me." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Everything else, every question you have, I will answer. I give you my word, but you need to walk out of this apartment with me in the next 60 seconds. She stared at him. The man with the scar glanced toward the window. Something in Arya's chest cracked open. Not dramatically, not with tears, but with the sudden, devastating clarity of a person who realizes that the story they thought they were in and the story they are actually in are 2 completely different things. She looked down at the broken glass at her feet, the water spreading across the tile. Then she looked up at Leo, this stranger, this husband, this whoever he was, and made the only decision available to her. She picked up her bag. "You have 60 seconds, she said. "Start walking." Something moved behind his eyes, brief, almost imperceptible. Then he turned toward the door, said 2 quiet words to the man with the scar, and led her out into the night, into a city that suddenly felt nothing like the one she'd woken up in that morning. And somewhere in the cold, dark stairwell, between the 4th floor and the street, Aria Bennett understood one thing with complete, bone-deep certainty. She had not married a waiter. She had no idea yet what she had married. But she was about to find out. The car was different this time, not the modest black sedan from the morning. This one was waiting in the alley behind the building. Longer, darker, with tinted windows that reflected nothing, and a quiet engine that barely made a sound when it started. 2 more men were already inside. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody spoke. Leo got in beside her, and the car moved before the door was fully closed. Aria sat with her bag in her lap and her hands flat on top of it, a deliberate, physical act of control, and watched Queens dissolve into the expressway in the side mirror. The city shrank. The lights thinned. And somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when the skyline had dropped completely below the horizon and there was nothing outside the windows but dark highway and darker tree line, she turned to face him. "Talk," she said. Leo had been looking straight ahead. At her word, he glanced at the 2 men in front, then back to her. He said nothing for a moment. Not stalling, she realized. Arranging. The way people arrange words when the truth is large and the wrong order makes it worse. Then he began. "Your father came to us 4 years ago," Leo said. "Not to Voss Capital, that's just a name on paper. To us. To me." He paused. "Bennett Enterprises was hemorrhaging money. 3 failed contracts, a lawsuit from a former partner, a credit line that had run out. He needed $4 million in 6 weeks, or the company folded." "And you gave it to him," Aria said. "Yes." "Why?" He glanced at her. "Because I needed something in return. Not the money. The money was nothing. I needed a connection to your company, a legitimate one, something that could be traced on paper to a real business with a real address and a real history." He turned back to the window. "Your father's company was clean. Whatever his other failings were, his business was clean. I needed that." Aria absorbed this slowly. So the loan was never about the money. No, it was about access to Bennett Enterprises. "To legitimacy," he corrected. "There's a difference." He looked at her again. "I never used it, Aria. Whatever you're thinking, I never touched your company. I never ran anything through your accounts, never leveraged your name. I took the access and left it sitting, unused." "Why?" A beat of silence. Outside, a highway sign for Poughkeepsie flashed white and disappeared. "Because the situation changed," he said. He told her the rest in pieces, and she assembled it the way she assembled everything, methodically, building the structure before filling in the details. A rival organization. A man named Dorian Voss. Real name, she noted, unlike the shell company, who had been systematically targeting Leo's operations for 18 months. Not with violence, not at first, with precision. Infiltrating supply chains, turning allies, bribing city officials who were useful. Quiet, surgical dismantling. And then Dorian had found out about the loan. "He threatened to expose your father's connection to me," Leo said. "Not just the loan. He was going to manufacture evidence, make it look like your father had been laundering money through Bennett Enterprises for years. Federal level. The kind of case that doesn't just close a company, it buries a family." Aria's jaw tightened. "So you called in the debt? Publicly?" "I called in the debt before Dorian could use it against both of you." His voice was even. "Measured. If I demanded repayment openly, it put me in control of the narrative. Your company's trouble became a private financial matter, not a criminal investigation." "And the marriage?" she asked. The words still felt wrong in her mouth. "How does marrying me fix any of that?" Leo was quiet for 3 full seconds. Because Dorian's plan wasn't just to destroy me, he said finally. His plan was to take everything I'd built and absorb it. And the one vulnerability he identified, the one gap in my operation he thought he could use, was that I had no one. Arya stared at him. No partner, Leo continued. No family. No person whose safety I'd compromise myself to protect. In our world, that's not strength. It's exposure. It means anyone can come at you from any angle without consequences. He paused. A man with nothing to protect is dangerous, but a man with something to protect is a target, she said quietly.
A man, he replied. It changes the calculations. It changes how people negotiate with you. It changes what they think they can take. He turned to look at her directly for the first time since he'd started talking. I needed someone real, not paid, not planted. Someone whose connection to me would hold up to scrutiny, whose background was clean, whose presence beside me would shift the entire board. The car hummed through the darkness. Arya didn't speak for a long moment. You chose me, she said. The pieces were locking together now, cold and clean and awful. You chose me specifically, before any of this happened, didn't you? It wasn't a question. Leo held her gaze. Yes.
The debt was called in because you needed a reason, a legitimate, documented reason to bring me into this. Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it was pulling tight. My father didn't just make a desperate decision 4 years ago. He handed someone a leash with my name on it. He didn't know, Leo said. He signed a contract. He didn't know what it would eventually be used for. But you did. Silence. Yes, he said again. The same word, heavier this time. She looked away from him and out into the black rush of the highway, and for several long minutes she simply breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The technique she used before walking into high-stakes boardrooms, before delivering news that would hurt people, before any moment that required her to function when everything in her wanted to do the opposite. She had walked into this thinking she was collateral, a payment, a number on a page being balanced against another number. She was not collateral. She was deliberate, chosen, constructed into this situation with the same cold precision that had clearly defined every move this man had made for years. That was so much worse, and so much more frightening than she had words for. You said you'd give me a way out, she said finally, still looking at the window. Back at the apartment. You said you'd give me a choice. I will, Leo said. When we reach the estate, I'll explain your options. All of them. Honestly. And if I choose to leave? A pause. Then I'll make sure you're protected until it's safe. But Arya... He stopped himself, started again more carefully. Dorian's people followed us tonight. They already know who you are. Married to me or not, that doesn't change now. She closed her eyes. Outside, the trees pressed close on both sides of the road, and the highway narrowed into something smaller. The city was gone completely. New York felt like a different country, a different life, a version of Tuesday that had belonged to someone else. She thought of 43 employees, her mother's name on a company she'd bled for, the cream silk blouse she'd picked out this morning because it was professional and appropriate, and she had actually thought, that this was just a transaction. She opened her eyes. The road ahead was dark and long and offered no visible ending. That made 2 of them. The estate appeared without warning. One moment there was nothing but tree line and darkness and a road that had narrowed to a single unmarked lane. Then the trees parted. Iron gates materialized out of the black, and beyond them, lit by low exterior lights that made the whole thing look less like a home and more like a statement, stood the kind of property that didn't exist on any public record. It was enormous. Stone-faced, 3 stories, with a wide gravel forecourt where 2 more black vehicles were already parked. Manicured grounds stretched away on both sides into the dark. A man stood at the gate with his hands clasped in front of him, and when the car slowed, he stepped aside without being asked. Arya said nothing. She had run out of reactions somewhere on the highway. Now she simply observed, filed, stored. The car stopped. Leo got out first, then came around to her side. Not performatively, just automatically, with the same efficient courtesy he'd shown all day. She didn't wait for him to open the door. She pushed it herself and stepped out into air that smelled like pine and cold earth, and nothing at all like New York. She stood in the forecourt of a mafia safe house in upstate New York in the same clothes she'd worn to her own courthouse wedding that morning, with a carry-on bag over one shoulder, and her entire life rearranged around her. She squared her shoulders and walked inside. The interior was not what she expected. She'd braced for something dark and aggressive, all leather and weaponry and the particular ugliness of power that doesn't care how it looks. Instead, the entrance hall was warm. High ceilings, heavy wood floors, the kind of furniture chosen for quality rather than display. A fireplace in the main room was already lit. Books on the shelves. Actual books, not decorative ones, their spines creased with use. It looked, uncomfortably, like someone actually lived here. A woman appeared from a side corridor, 50s, efficient, not unkind. She showed Arya to a room on the second floor without explanation. Clean towels, fresh clothes laid out in her approximate size, a view of the grounds from the window. Arya stood at that window for a long time after the woman left. Below, she could see the perimeter clearly now in the estate lighting. Guards moving in slow, overlapping patterns. Not randomly, methodically. Coverage without gaps. She counted 8 visible from her window alone, and understood immediately there were more she couldn't see. This was not a safe house. This was a command position. She found Leo an hour later. She hadn't been summoned. She went looking, because waiting in a room while her life unraveled around her was not something she was built for. She moved through the ground floor quietly, past a dining room where 2 men sat with laptops and spoke in low voices that stopped when she passed, past a closed door she could hear murmuring behind, until she found him in a room at the back of the house. It was set up as an office of sorts, large table, maps and documents spread across it, a bank of screens along one wall showing feeds from different locations she didn't recognize. Leo stood with his back to the door, studying something on the table. He'd changed out of the white shirt into something darker. He looked different. Not in face or posture, but in context, the way an actor looks different when you finally see them in the role they were written for. This was his role. "You could have knocked," he said without turning around. "You could have told me the truth before I married you," she replied. He turned then. If the observation landed, he didn't show it. He gestured to a chair across from the table. She sat, because her feet hurt, and pride had its limits. She looked at the screens behind him. "Are those live?" "Yes." "You're watching multiple locations?" "Always." She folded her hands on her knees and looked at him directly. "I want to know what this place is, not the cover story. The real answer." Leo pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He clasped his hands on the table, and there was something almost strange about it. A man surrounded by maps and surveillance screens, sitting across from his wife of one day with the posture of someone about to be honest. "It's a base," he said. "One of several. When things become unstable in the city, operations move here temporarily. It's secure. It's clean. Nobody outside a very small circle knows it exists." "Operations," she repeated. "You mean your organization?" "Yes." "Which does what, exactly?" He studied her for a moment, deciding, she thought, not whether to answer, but how much answer to give. She recognized the calculation. She'd done it herself in enough boardrooms. "Control," he said finally. "Influence over certain industries, certain city structures, import and supply networks. Some of it is gray, some of it is darker than gray. He didn't look away. I'm not going to dress it up for you, Arya. You're too intelligent for that, and I don't have the patience for it. She appreciated that, despite herself. How many people work for you? Enough. How long have you been running this? Since I was 24. He was 34 now, she calculated automatically. 10 years of this.
10 years of building something that required a safe house in the woods and 8 visible guards and a wife he'd selected like a chess piece. She leaned forward. I want to talk about the deception. Something shifted in his expression, minute, but there. I know why you did it, she said. You've explained the strategy, the board position, the calculation. I understand it. I even understand it well, which is the most irritating part. She paused. What I want to know is whether you considered at any point what it would cost me. Not the company. Me. Walking into a marriage with no information, no real choice. The fire in the next room crackled audibly through the wall. Leo was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to tell her he was actually considering the question rather than just forming an answer. Yes, he said. And I made a decision. I'm not going to pretend was clean. He held her gaze. I told myself that the alternative, telling you the truth before, would have put you in danger immediately, which was true, but... He stopped. But, she pressed, it was also convenient, he said quietly, that it was the right tactical choice, and the convenient one. Arya stared at him. In 10 years of business, of negotiations and contracts and rooms full of people choosing their words surgically, she could count on one hand the number of times someone had admitted to that particular thing, the place where strategy and selfishness looked identical, and most people only claimed one. She sat back. You said there was a way out, she said. Last night. You said you'd explain my options. I will. Now. Explain them now. He nodded slowly. Option 1, you leave. I arrange a cover identity, temporary relocation, security detail until Dorian's attention moves. It's not risk-free, but it's manageable. He paused. Option 2, you stay. As my wife, publicly, fully. We see this through together until Dorian is removed as a threat. And then? And then you walk away free. The debt gone, your company intact, your life your own. Arya looked at the maps on the table, at the screens, at this man who had arranged her life like a series of moves on a board, and was now, somehow, being the most straightforwardly honest person she'd spoken to in years. You said leaving isn't risk-free, she said. It isn't. How much risk? He met her eyes. More than I'd like to tell you. She almost smiled at that. Almost. I'll give you my answer in the morning, she said, standing. He nodded. She walked to the door, then stopped without turning around. The books on the shelf in the hall, she said. Dostoevsky, Camus, a worn copy of Meditations. A beat. Those are yours, not props. Silence. Yes, he said. She nodded once to the door and walked out. Behind her, she heard nothing. But somehow she knew, with the instinct she trusted above almost everything else, that Leo Carter was still sitting at that table long after she'd gone, not planning, just sitting. She gave him her answer at breakfast. The estate kitchen was large and unhurried, morning light cutting across the stone countertops in long, pale strips. Someone had made coffee, real coffee, not the bitter office machine kind, and left bread and fruit on the table. Arya sat with both hands around a mug and waited until Leo appeared in the doorway, already dressed, already alert in that way he seemed to permanently inhabit. She didn't let him sit down. I'm staying, she said. He stopped in the doorway, read her face, nodded once. Good, he said. Just that. No relief, no satisfaction, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who'd already begun planning for both outcomes and was now discarding one. She pointed at the chair across from her. "Now sit down and tell me what happens next." He almost smiled. She was starting to recognize the ghost of it, the slight adjustment at the left corner of his mouth that was as close as he apparently got. He sat. He told her. They would move again today, a different location, a property outside Albany, smaller, less visible. Staying in one place was a liability. Dorian's people had tracked them to Queens in under 6 hours, which meant someone in the outer circle was feeding information. Until that leak was identified and closed, mobility was the only reliable defense. "How long until you find the leak?" Arya asked.
"My people are already working it," Leo said. "Hours, maybe less."
"And Dorian himself? Where is he?" Leo looked at her with something that was nearly appreciation.
"Chicago. He runs his operation out of a penthouse on the Gold Coast. Very visible, very legitimate on the surface. Real estate, private equity, the usual architecture."
"Legitimate on the surface," she repeated. "You mean he has the same problem you have?"
"What problem?"
"He needs to look like something he isn't." She wrapped both hands around her mug again. "That's a vulnerability." Leo said nothing, but he was looking at her differently now. She could feel it without meeting his eyes, the way you look at something you'd underestimated. They left the estate at 9. 3 vehicles this time, staggered departures, different routes converging on the same highway 20 minutes north. Arya rode with Leo in the middle car. The man with the scar, she'd learned his name was Wren, drove. Another man she didn't know rode in front. The morning was clean and gray, the kind of upstate sky that couldn't decide between cloud and sun and settled for both. Arya watched the landscape move past her window and turned over the night's conversations in her mind, sorting, cataloging, building a picture from the pieces. She was 40 minutes into the drive, somewhere on a rural 2-lane highway with tree line close on both sides, when Wren said quietly, "We have a problem." She felt Leo go still beside her before she registered anything else. Not tense, still. The specific stillness of a body shifting from one mode to another. She looked up. Ahead, across the road, a black SUV was parked sideways. Not broken down, deliberately positioned. A roadblock. "Behind us," the man in front said. Arya turned. Another vehicle had appeared at the far end of the road, closing distance. "The lead car?" Leo asked. "Stopped," Wren said. "They hit them first." Leo's hand came across, not grabbing, just briefly firm on her forearm. "Stay low. Stay in the car. Don't move until I tell you." Then everything happened at once. The first gunshot came from the tree line to the right. She heard it before she understood what it was, a sharp crack that her body understood before her mind did. Then another. The windshield of a car ahead fractured. Men were moving outside, Leo's men, materializing from the vehicles with a speed and coordination that told her this was not their first ambush. Arya pressed herself low against the seat. This was nothing like the apartment. The apartment had been shocking, sudden, contained. This was the open air, and it was loud, sharper than she'd expected, more immediate, the kind of sound that went through you rather than past you. Her heart was somewhere in her throat, and her hands were flat against the car seat, and she was breathing in short, controlled bursts because that was all she could manage. Leo was no longer beside her. She turned, and through the window she saw him. He had moved to the front of the car, positioned behind the open door of the vehicle ahead. He had a weapon she hadn't seen him draw, and he was using it with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. Complete, focused, economical. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She had built a picture of him over the last 2 days from pieces: the watch, the screens, the guards, the maps, the careful, honest answers. She had understood intellectually that he was dangerous. Understanding intellectually and watching it were not the same thing. This man had served food to people.
He had stood in a courthouse and said, "I do," in a quiet, steady voice. He had given her his pillow and left her the bedroom and said, "You're my guest," like it was the most normal sentence in the world. And he moved through violence like it was a language he'd been born speaking. It lasted 4 minutes. She counted because counting was the only thing that kept her inside herself. Then it was over. The silence afterward was its own kind of loud. Voices calling positions, boots on gravel, the distant sound of an engine retreating. Leo appeared at the car door. He pulled it open and crouched to her level. "You're okay," he said. Looking at her face carefully, checking, she realized, not asking, assessing. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. He studied her for 1 more second, then offered his hand. She took it and stepped out of the car into cold morning air. 2 of Dorian's men were on the ground nearby, secured, not dead. 3 had retreated. Leo's team had contained it completely, absorbed it, neutralized it. And standing here in the aftermath, on a rural road in upstate New York, Arya could see that this was the work of something very precisely built. Not chaos. The opposite of chaos. Ren appeared at Leo's shoulder. "Falcone confirmed. The leak was Martinez. He's been held." Leo absorbed this with no visible reaction. "What do you want done?" Ren glanced at Arya, then back at Leo. The question in his eyes was clear. Leo didn't look at Arya, but he said simply, "Not here." She understood she'd just been shielded from something she wasn't sure she wanted to examine too closely. She walked a few steps away from the car, onto the narrow road shoulder, and breathed. Behind her she heard Leo's voice, low and even, issuing instructions she couldn't fully make out. Organizing the aftermath the way he organized everything, quickly, quietly, without visible emotion. She thought about the word monster. She'd rolled it around in her mind since the apartment, since the kneeling men and the silver watch and the conference room full of screens. Monster was the easy word, the one that put him in a box she could manage, a category she could keep a safe distance from. But monsters didn't check your face after gunfire to see if you were okay. Monsters didn't say, "Not here," to shield you from something ugly. Monsters didn't sit alone at a table after a hard conversation because someone had finally asked them a question they hadn't let themselves think about. She turned around. Leo was looking at her from across the road. He'd stopped issuing instructions. He was just looking at her. The pale gray eyes, the controlled face, the man who had spent 10 years building something ruthless and had somehow, in 2 days, allowed her to see parts of it clearly. She didn't look away. Neither did he. And standing on a cold highway, with the evidence of violence 20 feet behind her, Arya Bennett felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not violently, not suddenly, but in the slow, tectonic way that meant something was changing at a level too deep to stop. She was afraid of him. She was also, without question, glad he was here. Both things were true, and she was done pretending they weren't. Chicago arrived like a different world, not louder than New York, different loud. New York was vertical, compressed, a city that pushed upward because it had run out of ground. Chicago spread. It breathed differently, moved differently, carried its power in wider spaces and older architecture, and a wind off the lake that didn't apologize for anything. They'd flown in on a private charter, no announcement, no flight plan that meant anything, a small airfield outside the city that clearly existed for exactly this kind of arrival. A motorcade met them on the tarmac. By the time they crossed into the city limits, Arya had counted 11 people in their party, and she understood she was seeing only the visible layer. Leo's Chicago operation was based out of a building on the near north side. Unremarkable exterior, a legitimate importing firm on the lower floors, and above that, 3 floors that belonged to a different kind of business entirely. The elevator required a key and a code. Nobody used the stairs. The room they convened in on the top floor looked like a war council. 7 people around a long table when Arya and Leo entered. She recognized Ren. The others she didn't know. Men and 1 woman, ranging from mid-30s to late 50s, with the particular quality of people who had earned their seats through things that wouldn't survive daylight. They looked at Leo when he entered. They looked at Arya immediately after. Nobody spoke until Leo sat down. Then everybody did. She took a chair 1 removed from Leo's right, close enough to hear everything, far enough to observe the room. She'd learned that position in boardrooms before she was 25. The best seat was never at the center. It was the one with the widest view. The woman at the table spoke first. Mid-40s, close-cropped silver hair, the kind of face that had stopped performing patience years ago. Her name, Arya gathered quickly, was Nadia. "The Albany route is burned," Nadia said without preamble. "Martinez gave them more than the location. He gave them the secondary protocols. We have to assume anything he touched in the last 60 days is compromised." "How long was he turned?" Leo asked. "Nadia's best estimate is 6 weeks," said a heavyset man to her left. "Dorian recruited him," Leo said, not a question. "Directly," Nadia confirmed. "We pulled Martinez's financials this morning. 3 wire transfers, offshore, beginning 7 weeks ago. The amounts were specific, not round numbers. Someone wanted it to look like payments for services, not a bribe, a salary." Arya filed that without expression. Someone who understood how to construct a paper trail. That was specific. That was someone who thought in legal frameworks. "Dorian has lawyers," she said. The room looked at her. She didn't adjust under the attention. "Real estate and private equity," she continued, addressing Leo but speaking for the table. "You said that last night. That's not just a cover. That's infrastructure. He's running his financial operations through legitimate business structures, which means he has people who know how to build documentation that holds up to scrutiny." She paused. "The wire transfers to Martinez aren't sloppy. They're designed to survive a surface audit. Someone with that specific skill set drafted them." Nadia was looking at her with an expression that hadn't fully decided what it was yet. Leo said, "Go on." "The debt my father signed 4 years ago," Arya said. "The contract was airtight. My lawyer said so. Frighteningly so." She looked at Leo. "Was that contract yours or Dorian's?" A pause that told her everything before he answered. "It originated with me," Leo said carefully. "But the specific legal language, I've had it reviewed since last night. There are clauses in it that weren't in my original draft." "Dorian's lawyers modified it," Arya said. "We believe so, yes." "Which means Dorian knew about your arrangement with my father before you called in the debt." She sat forward. "He didn't just react to your marriage. He had already prepared for it. He modified that contract to ensure that when you did call it in, the terms would create the maximum—" She stopped herself, rebuilt the thought. "He wanted the marriage to happen." The room was very quiet. "Why?" Ren said from across the table. Arya looked at Leo. He was already looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize. The one that arrived when she reached something he'd already found and was waiting to see if she'd get there herself. "Because a man with nothing to protect is dangerous," she said slowly, echoing his own words from the car. "But a man who suddenly acquires something to protect, someone visible, someone public, someone with no training and no protection of her own, is exposed." She let that sit. "Dorian didn't try to prevent the marriage," she continued. "He engineered the conditions for it. He wanted Leo distracted, emotionally complicated, responsible for someone who could be used as leverage." She paused. "He wanted me to happen." The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of people processing. It was the silence of people who had just had something large confirmed. Nadia set down the pen she'd been holding. "She's right. The Albany ambush wasn't an attempt to kill you," said the heavyset man, looking at Leo.
If they wanted you dead, they had better positioning than that. They were trying to take her.
Arya heard this the way she heard difficult quarterly results, fully, without flinching, because flinching didn't change numbers.
Leverage, Leo said. His voice had gone flat in a specific way she hadn't heard before. Not cold, something more controlled than cold.
If they have her, Nadia said, they have you. Or they have evidence of your operation through Bennett Enterprises, which they've already built a paper trail for, with the modified contract. She looked at Arya. Either way, they win.
So the marriage that was supposed to protect the company, Arya said quietly, became the thing that made me the target.
Welcome to the game, Nadia said. Not cruelly, just honestly.
After the meeting, Leo took her to a room at the end of the floor, smaller, quieter, with a window that looked out over the city toward the lake. The water was silver-gray in the afternoon light, impossibly wide.
You should have told me all of this before, she said.
Yes, he said. He didn't qualify it.
Not for strategy. For me.
She turned from the window.
I walked into this thinking I was protecting my company. I had no idea I was being used as a weapon in someone else's war. You weren't supposed to know, he said. That was the point. And now? He was quiet for a moment. Now you know. And now... He stopped. Something moved in his face that she couldn't categorize. Now I'm sorry. Not for the plan. The plan was necessary. I'm sorry that it was you. She studied him. There it was again, that specific honesty that lived in him alongside the ruthlessness, the two things occupying the same space without canceling each other out. She'd never met anyone like that.
She'd met ruthless people who pretended at honesty, and honest people who were ruthless about it.
This was different. This was someone who had drawn a hard line inside himself and stood on both sides of it simultaneously. Dorian thinks I'm a liability, she said.
Yes.
He's wrong. She held Leo's gaze steadily. A liability is passive, something that weighs you down. What I actually am, she paused, feeling the idea solidify as she said it, is someone who understands exactly how he's built his operation, because I've spent 10 years studying businesses built on infrastructure and leverage and the right kind of documentation. She crossed her arms. He built a financial architecture to trap you. I know how financial architectures work. I know where they crack. Leo said nothing for a long moment. Outside, Chicago moved below them, indifferent and vast.
What are you proposing? He asked.
Nothing yet,
she said. I need to see everything. Every piece of Dorian's financial trail, every business entity, every name associated with Voss Capital and whatever else he's built. She met his eyes. I need a desk, a screen, and everything your people have gathered. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in that estate kitchen when she'd asked about Dorian's location, like something had arrived that he hadn't been expecting and wasn't sure yet what to do with. I'll have it ready tonight, he said. She nodded and turned back to the window. The lake was enormous from up here, silver and uncontained and stretching to a horizon she couldn't quite see. She thought about Dorian, sitting somewhere in this same city in his penthouse, looking at his own view, convinced he had already won. She thought about what it felt like when someone fundamentally underestimated you. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The gala was Arya's idea, not the attending. Leo had already planned that. A high-profile charity event on Chicago's Gold Coast that Dorian's circle would populate like clockwork, because men like Dorian never missed an opportunity to be seen. What was Arya's idea was the strategy underneath it. The reason for going that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the 3 days she'd spent at a desk on the top floor of Leo's Chicago building, dismantling Dorian Voss one financial document at a time. She'd found it on the second day. It wasn't hidden well, which told her something important about Dorian. He was meticulous with the visible layers and lazy with the foundations.
The way people were when they'd never been truly challenged. Underneath Voss Capital and the real estate entities and the private equity shell was a single trust account registered in Delaware, administered through a law firm in Grand Cayman, that served as the nervous system for everything.
Every operation, every payment, every bribe and acquisition and laundered dollar ran through it. One account, one point of failure. She'd walked into Leo's office at 11 at night with the documentation printed and laid it on his desk without a word. He'd read it, then read it again, then looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded, quick, and genuine.
"If this account gets flagged," she said, "everything collapses. Not gradually, immediately. His lawyers can't protect structure that doesn't exist anymore."
"We can't flag it ourselves without exposing—"
"We don't do it ourselves," she said. "We get the right documentation to the right federal desk through the right anonymous channel, and we let the system do what it does." She sat down across from him. "I've done this before. Not with criminal organizations, with corrupt competitors. The mechanism is the same. You just need someone who knows which door to knock on."
"Do you know which door?"
She met his eyes. "I know 3 of them." That was when he'd told her about the gala. She wore black. Not the careful, appropriate black of someone trying to look the part. A dress that moved like it had opinions of its own, that said, "I belong in every room I enter," without raising its voice. Leo had arranged it. She didn't ask how. They arrived together, publicly, with the full weight of presentation behind them. She'd understood by now that appearance in his world was its own form of language. Who stood beside you, how they carried themselves, whether they looked afraid. She had spent a decade learning not to look afraid. Tonight, she was fluent. The event was everything Chicago's Gold Coast promised. A ballroom of considerable architecture, candlelight, the particular species of wealth that wore its power quietly and its charity loudly. Arya moved through it with Leo at her side and felt, for the first time since Tuesday, like she was operating on terrain she recognized. This was a room full of leverage. She could read it like a balance sheet. She spotted Dorian Voss 40 minutes in. She recognized him from the photographs Nadia had pulled. Mid-50s, silver-templed, with the curated ease of a man who had decided long ago that he was always the most important person in any room he entered. He stood near the bar with 2 men she recognized from the financial documents as nominal directors of his shell companies, and he was smiling the particular smile of someone who thought the evening was already going his way. He hadn't seen them yet. "Don't look at him directly," Leo said quietly beside her. "I'm not," she said. She was looking at the room, at the exits, at the staff moving with trays. Something felt different, a texture in the air she couldn't name, a pattern just slightly off. She'd been in enough high-stakes situations in the past week to know what that feeling meant. "Something's wrong," she said. Leo's response was immediate. Not a question, not a dismissal. He was already scanning. "Ren," he said, barely moving his lips. Ren materialized from the crowd to their left. 2 words passed between them in a language she didn't catch. Ren moved away. "We should," Leo began. It happened very fast. A figure near the east corridor. Staff uniform, wrong posture. The particular stillness of someone waiting for a cue rather than working a room. Arya saw it in the same moment Leo did. She felt his hand close around her arm, already moving her sideways, already putting himself between her and the corridor. The sound that followed was not what she expected, not the sharp crack of the rural highway. Something faster, closer. The collective gasp of a ballroom realizing something was wrong before they understood what. Leo pulled her behind a structural column. Solid marble, she noted, the rational part of her brain filing this observation while the rest of her held completely still. His body was angled outward, shielding. She could hear controlled chaos unfolding behind her. Ren's voice, movement, the sound of the event's careful order coming apart. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then Leo said, "It's clear." She stepped out from behind the column.
The figure from the corridor was on the ground, secured by two of Leo's men, who had apparently been invisible all evening. The ballroom was a disturbed hive, people moving toward exits, voices rising, the beautiful order of the gala dissolving into something raw. Dorian Voss was nowhere she could see. Leo looked at her, the same check he'd done on the highway, her face methodically. "I'm fine," she said, same as before. Steadier this time. He nodded, but he didn't move away immediately. He stayed close, and his hand was still at her arm, and the space between them was smaller than it had ever been, and she was aware of all of it in precise, quiet detail. "He tried to take you in a room full of witnesses," she said.
"He's getting desperate," Leo said.
"No." She shook her head, the pieces clicking together cleanly. "He's getting scared. He knows I've been in your building for 3 days. He knows I'm not what he planned for." She looked at him. "He knows I found something." The filing went through at 7 a.m. the next morning. Not through any door Arya had hesitated to knock on. She'd identified the right federal contact 2 years prior during a corporate fraud case tangentially connected to one of Bennett Enterprises' former partners. A person who was meticulous, quietly powerful, and owed her nothing but a fair look at solid documentation. The documentation was immaculate. She'd made sure of it. By noon, Dorian's Delaware trust account was frozen, pending investigation. By evening, 2 of his shell company directors had been called in for questioning, one of whom, Arya had noted from her research, had spent considerable energy building a record of cooperation with federal authorities in order to protect a separate matter entirely. He cooperated immediately. By the following morning, the architecture Dorian Voss had spent a decade constructing had developed a crack at its foundation that no lawyer in Grand Cayman could stop from spreading. Leo heard the confirmation from Nadia at the long table in Chicago and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Arya across the table with the kind of look that arrived when words were genuinely insufficient. "It's not finished," Arya said before he could speak. "It won't be quick, but the structure is broken. He can't rebuild it under federal scrutiny. Everything he does from this point, every move, every operation, is now exposed." She set down her pen. "He's not a threat anymore. He's a problem on a timeline." Nadia almost smiled. Almost. Ren, across the table, looked at Leo. Leo looked at Arya. "We should talk," he said. "Just us." They stood at the window again. Different city, different building, same quality of space between them that had been quietly rearranging itself all week. Below, Chicago moved in its wide, breathing way. "You should know," Leo said, "that what you did in there, the documentation, the contact, the methodology, that's more effective than anything I could have done with force. More permanent." "I know," she said, not arrogantly, just accurately. "I need to ask you something." She waited. "Stay," he said, "not for the arrangement, not for the debt or the company or the strategy. Those are done." He paused, and something shifted in his face, the controlled surface giving way, briefly, to something underneath that was neither ruthless nor calculating, just true. "Stay because I'm asking you to." Arya looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Tuesday, about a letter with a number that had dissolved her whole life into something unrecognizable, about a courthouse and 11 minutes and a pen and her name beneath his, about Queens and a broken glass and 4 men kneeling and a highway and gunfire and Chicago and a ballroom column and 3 days at a desk finding the crack in someone's empire. She thought about who she'd been on Monday, sharp, certain, alone in the particular way of people who've decided competence is enough. She thought about who she was now. "I have a condition," she said. His expression didn't change, but she felt him wait. "The operation," she said. "What you run. I'm not asking you to dismantle it overnight. I know that's not how it works. But I need it moving.
away from the gray, away from the dark. She held his gaze. Toward something that doesn't require a safe house and 8 guards and a leak named Martinez. She paused. Your infrastructure is extraordinary. Your loyalty networks, your supply chains, your reach, all of it could function in the light. It would take time. It would take work. She almost smiled. It would take someone who knows how financial architecture works. Leo was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the lake was there again, vast and silver, and stretching to a horizon neither of them could fully see. "That's not a small condition," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her, and in the pale gray eyes she'd been reading all week, the careful eyes, the scanning eyes, the eyes that checked her face on a highway to see if she was okay, she saw something settle.
Something that had been held at a careful distance, finding, finally, that the distance was no longer necessary. "All right," he said. Just that. The same economy with words he brought to everything. But she'd learned by now that the smaller he made his words, the larger what he meant by them. She nodded, turned back to the window. Below them, Chicago breathed, wide and unhurried and full of every kind of beginning. Neither of them spoke for a while, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence of 2 strangers on opposite sides of a long bridge anymore. It was something more comfortable than that, more honest. The silence of 2 people who had survived the same storm and come out on the same side without fully planning to. Arya thought about the word empire. She'd spent her whole life building one of her own, smaller, quieter, legitimate, built on late nights and hard math and a name she'd clawed back from the edge of ruin. She knew what it cost. She knew what it asked of a person. She thought about what it might look like. The thing they could build. Power with structure. Reach with accountability. An empire that didn't need to hide. Not perfect. Nothing real ever was. But hers. She looked sideways at him, this man she'd married in 11 minutes on a Wednesday, who had turned her life completely inside out and stood in the aftermath of it being honest about his part in it, who had checked her face on a rural highway and said, "Not here," to protect her from something ugly, and sat alone at a table long after a hard conversation because someone had finally asked him something he hadn't let himself think about. She had not chosen this, but standing here, in this city, in this moment, with this person beside her, she was choosing it now. That was the difference. That was everything. 3 weeks later, New York. The office Arya had chosen for their joint operation was not in Leo's world, and not entirely in hers. It was a floor they'd leased in a midtown building. Clean address, legitimate shell company as tenant, the kind of space that could appear in a financial disclosure without raising questions. Floor-to-ceiling windows, 2 desks, a long table that had already accumulated the organized chaos of a project in motion. She'd insisted on the 2 desks. Leo had looked at the floor plan, looked at her, and said nothing, which meant he understood. They were building something together. That didn't mean she was disappearing into his world. It meant they were making a new one. And new things needed their own architecture, not borrowed from either of the old ones. The first week back in New York had been the hardest. Not because of danger. Dorian's operation had continued its quiet collapse under federal scrutiny, and without financial infrastructure, the threat he posed had reduced from a loaded weapon to a slow leak. Wren's team monitored it daily. There were still loose elements, still names on a list that required watching. But the engine was broken. It was a matter of time. The hardest part was everything else. Leo's organization, the real one, the decade-old structure of influence and gray market operation, and loyal personnel who had built their lives around a particular way of doing things, had to be told something. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Arya had sat in on that meeting. She'd expected resistance. Men who had spent years operating in shadow didn't typically welcome a woman with a business degree and a plan for legitimacy walking into their structure with suggestions.
She'd prepared for it the way she prepared for hostile boardrooms, anticipated objections, structured her entry, kept her voice level and her evidence clear. What she hadn't prepared for was Nadia. The silver-haired woman had arrived in New York 2 days after they did, sat down across from Arya in the Midtown office with a coffee she hadn't been offered and had made herself, and said without preamble, "How long do you think this actually takes? Realistically?" Arya had looked at her. 3 years minimum, more likely 5. Nadia had nodded slowly. "And you're willing to do that?" "I'm willing to start it," Arya said. "Starting is what I do. I'm good at it." Nadia studied her for a long moment with those careful, patience-free eyes. Then she picked up her coffee. "Then we should talk about the import networks first. That's the cleanest entry point. Easiest to legitimate without restructuring the relationships underneath." It was not approval, exactly. It was the specific pragmatism of a person who has decided that the direction of travel is set and would rather influence it than argue with it. Arya accepted it for what it was. Leo, she was learning, was the most difficult part of the project. Not difficult like resistance. He had agreed, and his word, she'd come to understand, functioned like a structural beam. Once given, it didn't flex. The difficulty was different. It was the difficulty of watching someone who had spent 10 years operating by a particular set of rules begin the uncomfortable work of rewriting them. She saw it in small things, a decision that would previously have been made in 20 seconds taking a minute, a phone call he'd take standing up, then put down and sit with for a while, a habit of solving problems with force meeting, for the first time, the habit of solving them with process, slower, less satisfying in the immediate term, requiring a trust in systems that his entire career had taught him not to extend. She didn't push. She'd learned that about him. He moved at the pace of genuine decision, not performance. Pushing produced nothing. Patience produced everything. One evening, she found him at the long table in the Midtown office, her financial models spread in front of him, the import network documentation beside them. He wasn't reading. He was looking at the window. "You look like someone doing math they don't like the answer to," she said. He glanced at her. "I'm trying to understand how you do it." "Do what?" "Trust a system." He looked back at the window. "You build a legal structure. You file the right documents. You route through the right channels. And then you—" He paused. "You believe it will work. You trust that the mechanism functions." "It does function," she said. "Imperfectly, slowly, but yes." "My entire operation is built on not trusting mechanisms," he said, "on assuming the mechanism is compromised, on maintaining control personally, directly, at every point." "I know," she said. "That's why it works in the dark and doesn't work in the light." She sat down at the table. "In the light, you can't personally control everything. You have to build things that control themselves. Rules, structures, accountability." She paused. "It's harder, actually. Staying in control of everything yourself is exhausting, but simple. Building something that functions without you, that's the difficult work." He was quiet for a moment. "You've done it." "I'm doing it," she corrected. "Constantly. It's not finished. It doesn't finish." She looked at him. "That's the other thing you have to accept. There's no point where it's secured and you can stop. You just keep building." He looked at the documents, then at her. "You find that tolerable?" he asked. "I find it interesting," she said. "There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression, not the ghost of a smile this time, the actual thing. Brief and quiet and more disarming than she'd expected. She looked away before it could do anything further. The moment that changed the tenor of things happened on a Thursday. Arya was at her desk, midway through a conference call with a logistics firm that formed the first legitimate front for one of Leo's import channels. The conversation was going well. The numbers worked, the structure was clean, the firm's principals had no reason to ask questions they weren't asking. Leo came in halfway through, set a coffee on her desk without interrupting, and went to his own. She finished the call, set the phone down.
"That's the third clean conversion this week," she said without turning. "I know," he said. "Ren flagged it." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't catalogued yet, something between careful and open, occupying a space that she wasn't sure he'd let many people see. "The Martinez situation is resolved," he said. "Fully." A pause. "Nadia has confirmed there are no remaining leaks in the inner circle." "Good." She watched his face. "Is that what you came in here to tell me?" "No," he said. He got up from his desk and came to hers, not crowding it, just close enough that the conversation changed register. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and New York moved indifferently behind the glass. "I want you to take the operational lead on the conversion," he said. "Not advisory, lead. Full authority over the restructuring timeline and methodology." She stared at him. In his world, she understood, authority was not a courtesy. It was not delegated carelessly. It was the most specific expression of trust available in his vocabulary, more specific than words, more binding than sentiment. "You understand what you're offering," she said. "Yes." "The people in your organization will follow the structure," he said, "because I say so, and because—" He paused, and the careful precision of his language loosened slightly, just slightly. "Because you've already earned it. They know it. I know it. The only person who seems uncertain is you." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, New York was doing what New York always did, relentlessly, indifferently, at full volume. The city that had handed her a letter on a Tuesday and dissolved everything she thought she knew about her own life. She thought about 43 employees who had no idea how close they'd come to losing everything. She thought about her mother's name on a company she'd rebuilt from scratch. She thought about a courthouse and 11 minutes and a name she'd signed beneath a stranger's. She thought about all the Tuesdays she'd survived. She looked up at Leo. This man, this empire, this choice she kept making more deliberately each day. "All right," she said. The same word he'd used, the same economy. He recognized it. She saw him recognize it, the brief, quiet acknowledgement of something returned. She turned back to her desk, picked up her pen, pulled the logistics file toward her. Behind her, she heard him go back to his own desk, the sound of him sitting, the quiet of two people working in the same room on the same thing from their own separate angles. She had not planned any of this, but she was, she realized, in the specific, grounded, bone-deep way that didn't require announcement, exactly where she intended to be, and tomorrow they would keep building. 6 months later, New York. The Bennett Carter Group opened its doors on a Tuesday. Arya had chosen the day deliberately. Every significant thing in her life had happened on a Tuesday. The letter, the decision, the beginning of something she hadn't had a name for yet. It seemed right that this should happen on one too, that the day which had once meant disaster should learn to mean something else. The office was on the 32nd floor of a midtown building with clean lines and a view of the city that made no apologies. The name on the door was plain, professional, unhurried. A private investment and logistics firm with an impeccable legal structure, a growing client list that spanned 3 industries, and an internal architecture that only 2 people in the building understood in its entirety: Arya and Leo. The morning of the opening, she arrived first. She always arrived first. Leo had stopped being surprised by this approximately 4 months ago, and had started simply leaving her coffee on her desk before he left each evening, so it was there when she came in. It was the kind of small, unannounced accommodation that said more than any conversation they'd had. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with her coffee and looked at New York the way she'd looked at it from her old office on the morning of the letter. The yellow cabs, the lunch crowds that hadn't started yet, the pigeons that didn't care about anything. Same city, entirely different weight. 6 months. She catalogued them the way she catalogued everything, in structure, in progress, in what had been built and what remained.
Dorian Voss had been indicted 8 weeks after the Delaware trust account was frozen. The federal case had moved with the particular momentum of investigations that have their documentation already organized and their cooperating witnesses already frightened. His lawyers had fought it, expensively, loudly, with the full architecture of legitimacy he'd spent years constructing, and had found, piece by piece, that the foundation was gone. The building had nothing to stand on. He was awaiting trial in Chicago. He would be for some time. The remaining loose elements of his operation had dissolved without central financing, not dramatically, not with confrontation, simply evaporating the way things evaporate when the money stops. Wren's team had monitored the last of them for 3 months and found nothing worth watching. The file had been closed 2 weeks ago, Leo had told her over dinner. She'd nodded. They'd finished eating. That was how it ended. Not with fireworks, not with a confrontation that felt proportionate to everything it had cost. Just a file closed, a threat removed. The particular quiet of something being over. She'd learned that about real endings. They rarely announce themselves. Leo arrived at 8:45, which was 15 minutes later than her and 20 minutes earlier than anyone else. He set his jacket over the back of his chair, looked at the organized state of her desk, and looked at her.
"You've been here since 7, he said.
7:15, she corrected. The difference is meaningful to you.
Accuracy is meaningful to me.
The ghost arrived at the corner of his mouth. She'd stopped cataloging it as a ghost 3 months ago. It was just his smile. Small, unhurried, arriving only when something genuinely warranted it. She'd come to trust it more than most people's full expressions. He came to stand beside her at the window. Below, New York was beginning its morning in earnest. Deliveries and school runs, and the particular organized chaos of a city that didn't pause for anything, including its own history.
"How does it feel?"
he asked. She considered the question properly, the way he'd learned to give her space to consider things. Early on, he'd expected immediate answers. He operated in immediacy, had spent a decade where hesitation was a liability. She'd operated in precision, where the right answer delivered slowly outperformed the fast wrong one. They'd adjusted to each other, somewhere in the middle, without formally negotiating it.
"Like the beginning of something," she said. "Not the end." He nodded. "Good."
"You sound relieved."
"I am." He glanced at her. "I was concerned you'd say it felt like arrival, like something finished."
"Nothing's finished," she said. "You said that yourself, actually. 3 months ago, Midtown office, Thursday evening." She looked at him sideways. "You said, I'm paraphrasing, that building something is a continuous act, not a destination." He was quiet for a moment.
"I was quoting you."
"I know," she said. "I noticed." The staff arrived between 9 and 9:30. 31 people, most of them from Aria's side of the operation. Finance, logistics, legal, compliance. 7 from Leo's world. People who had made the transition with varying degrees of comfort and universal degrees of competence. Nadia, who had become something Aria didn't have a clean word for. Not a friend, exactly. Not merely a colleague, had taken the head of security and risk management with the brisk efficiency of someone doing what she'd always actually been doing, just with better paperwork. Wren had declined a formal role. He'd shown up anyway. He stood near the lobby entrance in civilian clothes, looking uncomfortable about it, and when Aria passed him mid-morning, she said, without stopping, "There's a desk in the East Wing. It doesn't have a nameplate yet." She heard him exhale behind her, something that might have been relief. The afternoon brought the detail work, the specific, unglamorous, necessary machinery of a real operation making itself real. Contracts reviewed, systems tested, 3 phone calls with the logistics firm that had become their cleanest conversion. A 40-minute meeting with their legal team that covered compliance frameworks in enough granular detail that 2 people fell briefly silent out of sheer density. Aria ran it,
Leo sat at the table and watched her run it with the focused attention of someone who was still, quietly, continuously, learning a language. He'd come further in 6 months than she'd expected. She'd told him so once. He'd said, "You're a demanding teacher." She'd said, "You're a fast student." Neither of them had said anything else. They hadn't needed to. At 6 in the evening, when the office had thinned and the city outside had shifted from afternoon to the amber and blue of early dark, Arya found herself at her desk with a document she'd been working toward for 3 months. The final restructuring agreement. The last formal instrument converting the remaining gray area assets in Leo's organization into registered, compliant, auditable business entities. She drafted it herself, had it reviewed by 2 independent legal firms who knew only their piece of it, had revised it 4 times. She printed it, set it on the desk. Leo appeared in the doorway of her office. She'd stopped being surprised by his timing. He had an instinct for significant moments that she'd stopped questioning. She turned the document toward him and set a pen beside it. He looked at it, then at her. "This is the last one?" he said. "The last major instrument. After this, we're in maintenance mode. Ongoing compliance, quarterly review, the usual." She paused. "But structurally, yes, this is the last one." He came to the desk, read it, properly, fully, the way she'd watched him read everything she put in front of him. He never skimmed. She'd come to appreciate that about him more than she could easily articulate. He picked up the pen, signed it, set the pen down. She countersigned beside him. They both looked at it for a moment. This document, this piece of paper, this instrument that represented the end of one thing and the architecture of another. "I need to tell you something," he said. He wasn't looking at the document anymore. He was looking at her. She waited. "When I chose you," he said, carefully, like every word was load-bearing, "I chose you because you were clean, because your company was clean, because you were the right piece for the right position on the board." He paused. That was true, but it was also not the whole truth. She looked at him. "I had a file on you," he said, "before I approached your father's situation. I'd been watching Bennett Enterprises for 18 months. Not to use, just—" He stopped. "Your company had almost folded twice. Both times you'd rebuilt it, alone, without help, without outside capital, without—" He paused again. "I found that—" "Interesting?" she offered, with the specific deliberateness of someone returning a word. His expression moved, fully, openly, in a way she'd only seen a handful of times. "Yes," he said. "I found it interesting." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at New York. Dark now, lit from below, the city that didn't pause for anything. The city that had handed her a letter on a Tuesday and ended one life and started another without asking permission. She looked back at Leo. "I know," she said simply. He frowned slightly. "You know?" "I've known for about 4 months," she said. "That the file existed, that the choice wasn't purely strategic." She tilted her head. "You're not as unreadable as you think you are." The silence that followed was the warm kind. He sat down on the edge of her desk, not his desk, hers, in a way that was easy, unhurried, familiar. She turned her chair slightly to face him. New York moved behind the glass. "So," he said. "So," she replied. "We built a thing," he said. She looked around the office. The 32 employees who had gone home to their own lives, the desks and the systems and the compliance frameworks and the signed document on her desk. The beginning of something legitimate, something that could survive daylight. "We built a thing," she agreed. He reached out, not dramatically, not with announcement, and covered her hand on the desk with his hand over hers. Still. She looked down at it, thought about a courthouse, 11 minutes, a pen, her name beneath his on a piece of paper she'd signed without knowing what she was actually agreeing to. She knew now. She turned her hand over, held his.
Outside, New York kept moving, relentless and indifferent and magnificent. And on the 32nd floor of a midtown building, in an office with 2 desks and a long table and a view that made no apologies, 2 people sat quietly in the amber city light, not at the end of something, at the beginning. And for the first time and longer than she could remember, Aria Bennett did not feel the need to calculate what came next. She already knew.